I'm really excited about this topic. I want to tell you, first I'll introduce myself again. I'm Sarah Vaya. I'm a professor and climate extension specialist at the University of Maryland in College Park. And this has turned out to be a really fascinating topic. There's so much great information that I am just really going to lay the groundwork and give you some fundamentals today, and then maybe I'll give an update at some time in the future, but I think I'll provide a ton of information that'll be useful for you. Okay, just to put ourselves in the mood, I want to read this quote from Paul Hawken's book, Regeneration. Protection of biodiversity is not a sideshow to the climate problem. It is at the heart of the solution. And I've been talking for a few years about how biodiversity loss and climate change are associated. And that is absolutely the case. So we'll just get going with this. Okay, here's a little outline. First, I want to talk about why we would want to rewild in the first place. Part of that is the shocking scale of biodiversity loss and the fact that we are in the middle of what many scientists call the sixth great mass extinction. The first five were caused by events having nothing to do with humans, like the continents moving around and stuff like that. But the sixth extinction is definitely on us, and it's having a big impact on ecosystem services. And then the last part of this section is when we try to manage species to recover biodiversity, there are a lot of unintended consequences of what seem like pretty simple management decisions. So I'll talk to you about that. Then I'll talk about what rewilding is and how it differs from conservation. And part of rewilding, and there's some sort of misunderstanding, I think, about this, is the extent to which we are trying to introduce species to recover some past. And if we are trying to recover the past, well, which past is it we're trying to recover? Actually, I will tell you that we're really not trying to recover the past, but I'll get there in a minute. And then I'll talk about how several rewilding projects have occurred, first in the UK and then in the US. There's sort of two different traditions here. And I'll mention a few barriers to success for rewilding programs. And then I'll talk about different scales of rewilding. I will have already talked about large scale rewilding up here, but I want to talk a little bit about rewilding in your community and your yard at the end. So that's where we're going. The scale of biodiversity loss is really shocking. This is the slide I showed last year, and they talk about climate change and biodiversity loss. These pictures are from an article in The Guardian. Here's the citation. Humans are just 1/100th of 1%. That's 1 out of 10,000, higher math, 10,000, I think. But we have destroyed 83% of wild mammals, okay? So of all the mammals on Earth now, 96% are either livestock or humans. Only 4% are wild mammals. Humans have driven extinct 83% of wild mammals, 80% of marine mammals, 50% of plants, 15% of fish. Mostly because we haven't gotten to the fish yet, but we are having a big impact on fisheries. 70% of all birds that are out there are now chickens and other poultry. 30% are wild, better than mammals, but still not as good as it could be. So there have been 5 mass extinctions in Earth history. And as I alluded to just a moment ago, the 6th extinction is all on us. And it started a long time ago with extinction of what they call the megafauna. They call these megafauna because they are giant animals like mastodons. I mean, in North America, before human impacts, we had lions. We had, of course, ancient bison, bigger than today's bison. We had giant bears and mammoths and camels, right? Who knew? Ground sloths. These ground sloths are just enormous. And saber-toothed cats, and they're all gone now. They were driven extinct by humans, maybe aided a little bit by climate change, but mostly by humans, between 12,000 and 18,000 and 12,000 years ago. Because when we talk about the past, the more distant past is the bigger number. In Europe, because humans got to Europe earlier, the extinctions began about 40,000 years ago and ended 20,000 years ago. And they had a lot of big big mammals then. I'm not sure why they show this. It's not a rabbit, it's some kind of hare. I guess it's a mega hare, which is not made on this picture. But this giant bovine is an auroch, and I'll talk more about those later. But then, there are other very large animals driven extinct by humans. This picture is from the book Wilding, and I guess I zipped past the picture of this book at the beginning, but this book is by Isabel Tree and Charlie Burrell. Fantastic book, okay? And they show this graphic of extinctions. Again, in North America, there were, let me see, these are the ones that are extinct, I believe. 45 animals went extinct, and these are the ones that are pictures of some of the ones that went extinct, and here are the ones that are left, like elk and, big, I think these are elk. Anyway, South America, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Africa is interesting. Not as many large animals were driven extinct in Africa, and the theory is because humans evolved on the African continent, that there was more a longer contact between humans and these large animals, which is why they didn't seem like such awesome hunting targets when humans arrived. Here's a good picture that really shows the sort of rapid rise of extinctions. This is in Australia. After humans arrived, peaking out and then basically falling off as the animals were essentially eliminated. Now, this has really changed things because these big mammals have and had a huge impact on ecosystems. Most of these large animals were migratory. So we, I think we're more or less familiar with the buffalo, which are making a comeback now, but really had a very rough period there for a while after, European colonists basically killed them all off. Most of these animals are migratory, which means they'll eat a little bit and they'll move around. And this has a big impact on ecosystems. They move the nutrients around. They eat the grass over here, and then they go poop it out over there. And this fertilizes large areas, and it makes that ecosystem thing they call nutrient cycling more efficient, right? Because they're sort of moving the nutrients out of the soil and moving it around the continent. Native herbivores grazed and would move on before the grasses were damaged. So that's sort of like what people are trying to recreate with rotational grazing now, which I'll talk about in October when I'm able to give that the regenerative agriculture talk. So they would graze and move on, basically stimulating the grasses, but not grazing them down to the ground, which is what cattle do on rangelands, and they'd leave, really degraded land. And it's kind of shocking how many cattle are grazed on these rangelands, and they have very bad impacts on them. And their owners pay nothing, which I can't understand, but there it is. Large mammals also dispersed seeds over large distances, and that is really good for plant populations, well, all populations, to have sort of a lot of gene exchange between different regions mediated by these animals, and that increases genetic diversity in the plant populations, which is good. So in order to really successfully rebuild biodiversity that includes these large animals, we need to establish sort of corridors for movement between core habitat sites. So, we can't have lots of animals roaming around everywhere, but we can have them in sort of core areas like national parks and other places. But if we have corridors where they can move, that would be really, really useful. And it's a little harder to pull off, but it would be important. Okay. All right. Large grazers maintain grasslands in sort of a dynamic pattern of natural disturbance. So they, animals like, this is the old time breed of cattle, British Longhorns, that's right, English Longhorns. And it turns out that cattle, unlike sort of biting animals like animals that bite their foliage like horses, or rabbits, Cattle wind their tongues around both single blades and whole little shrubs and stuff and pull them right out. And so they're very sort of disruptive, and they uproot stuff and they do a lot of trampling. And this is another ancient breed, which is the males root around and sort of dig these giant holes, and aided by their horns. And this stimulates insects and all kinds of other good stuff. These large native grazers would often eat wider range of plants than we see in smaller ones like beef cattle, which tend to basically go in and pick the best grass and ignore everything else. These old time breeds would eat a lot more of what's there. The great thing about grasslands is that they store a gigantic amount of carbon. I was really unaware of how much until I started reading about it. And most of this, of course, is stored underground. If you came to the soil webinar, you'll remember that native plants have very deep roots, and so they store a lot of carbon underground where fire can't destroy it. So a problem with thinking that we're going to store a lot of carbon in woodlands is the increasing rate of wildfires, which are, well, really getting very, very common and destructive. Now, we didn't start causing extinctions in the ocean back thousands of years ago, but we're catching up with it. They're more recent, but they're just as focused on large species. And this is a great picture from that book, Wilding, again by Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell, showing how in 1957, so people who go out in boats to do, deep sea fishing always want to catch giant fish, right? And so here's a picture from 1957 where some of the fish are so big. I mean, they're basically as tall as a person. Here's 1965, they're a little bit smaller. 1980, okay, we're getting a lot smaller. And 2007, which was, well, I have taken my kids fishing in the ocean, and I have a picture of my younger son, probably holding a fish about this big. But you can see the change between, 2007 and back in 1957, because all the big fish are gone. So here's a graph from a scientific paper. There are different kinds of fish. Piscivores are ones that eat other fish. Large benthivores eat things off the bottom. So this is, smaller and smaller size. And you can see that the larger classes of fish have declined a lot. Okay, this is between 1970 and 2008. A steep decline, a pretty steep decline in the next size class, and then less decline in the smaller ones. Well, they don't have that much farther to go. Whaling has put a big dent, huge dent in the whale population. And again, that's also changed nutrient cycling in the ocean, because the whales move around over a large territory. Okay, so extinction in the ocean. Plants and insects are not doing that great either. This is a picture from a report from the Royal Botanical Gardens, which illustrates that 2 in 5 of all plants are estimated to be threatened with extinction. And for those of you who don't, do higher math, that's 40%. I had to remind myself of that. 571 individual species have actually been noted to go extinct in the last 250 years, which means, that's it for them. We're never going to see them again. 40% of insect species are declining and 33% are endangered, as discussed in this article in The Guardian. But I read yesterday as many as 500,000 species. So 500K means 500,000 insect species may already be extinct, which is really scary. I mean, there's probably formal estimates are maybe 1 million species, but there are probably many, many more species that are not really known to science, and they're going extinct very rapidly. Modern extinction this is behind something on my screen, so I can't really read it. But currently, it's centered in the this is for terrestrial vertebrates, centered in tropical regions. So here's the Amazon basin. Here's some other regions. This is a senior moment here, Caribbean. And we can see in Africa and of course, Asia, Southeast Asia, big hotbed of diversity and extinction. I'm not sure what's going on up here, but you can see there's an awful lot of extinction, species threatened in these other areas. The impacts of extinction on ecosystems are, we're having some extinction in North America and Europe, but we really didn't have that many species to start with. Nothing like what is found in the Amazon. This is why, like, losing tropical rainforests, which is what these areas are, is so devastating. Okay, so, why is this a problem? Who cares about it? It turns out, and you probably knew this already, the natural world, all the different diverse organisms control what they call ecosystem services, which is sort of jargon. But what ecosystem services are essentially the interactions between all the living things and the non-living world, soil, water, et cetera, that provide a healthy environment. Oh, sorry, this is cut off a little bit, but here are various different ecosystem services. This says human exploitation of these. These are the so-called provisioning services, food, medicine, raw materials, especially for, like building and other things. So we basically exploit this. Water is becoming a really big issue. And we are losing a lot of these so-called supporting ecosystem services, healthy soil, here's biodiversity, habitat, and photosynthesis. As we lose plant and as we lose plant cover, we're losing this. And we're losing these so-called regulating services. Now, these are important: flood control, climate regulation, cleaning the air and the water, pollination. These are things that keep us going. And we are really starting to see impacts here. Lots more flooding. Of course, we're having problems with climate change. We have dirty air and water. We're losing pollinators. So we're having a lot of trouble here. And then, of course, you might think, well, these are sort of, optional, but they're really not. Education, recreation, spirituality, aesthetics. I mean, the idea that we can enjoy the natural world, we can only enjoy it if we have a natural world, if we have a diversity of organisms. So we really need to try to do whatever it takes to rebuild the stuff. Many of you may know that I was actually trained and spent most of my career being an evolutionary biologist. And so I love these evolutionary interactions among organisms. And they basically, all the different ways that organisms interact have been tuned up by 3.5 billion years of evolution. And so this is a huge and important and awesomely interesting legacy that we're sort of not being very careful with. Development, agriculture, and all the other things that humans do are disrupting these interactions and compromising our key ecosystem services by reducing biodiversity. And, I don't care who you are or, how much money you have, but not even humans can fight the laws of nature. And I think this is one reason I have enjoyed giving these webinars so much is that it's very satisfying to me to help other people understand how cool biology is and how important some of these interactions are. Okay, so what is the root cause of modern biodiversity loss? Well, obviously us, but there's really two attitude problems. I've talked about one of them in the past, and I'll talk about another one today. In Western cultures, this is a familiar one. We often think of ourselves as outside and above nature, so that we, can basically have dominion over all of the other organisms. We can use them for our own purposes. We can harvest them at will. We can do whatever we want. I think there's not a very widespread recognition that we actually are all interdependent. It's more like, hey, here's us, there's you guys, you're there for us to use. Well, that's really not working out very well right now. Secondly, and this is more apropos of today's talk, we, and I'll just, say humans in general, think we can manage other species, okay? That we can not just be the, sort of manager of them, but the steward of them. But the interactions among species are a lot more complicated than I think even professional wildlife managers might admit. I maybe should give them a little more credit, but they are really complicated. And we make these simple management changes and essentially wind up mucking up everything because we don't really understand how food webs work. So I decided it was worth investing a little bit of time in talking about some of the sort of fundamentals here so that you can understand how maybe things don't turn out like everyone thinks they're going to. So food webs describe feeding interactions or trophic interactions, as the scientists call them. And they're always really super simplified. Even one like this that has a lot of, looks like a lot of entries, really way simpler. I had some friends in the UK that I worked with for a while who actually went out and tried to map food webs, and they would come back, from a piece of forest and say, we got 200 different species on our food web. So this is really a simplified interaction, but an argument that sort of has raged in ecology for years is what controls the numbers of individuals in species, the size of populations. Is it predation, where these predators up here at the top of the food web control the numbers of things below by eating them? Or is it the food supply, where the availability of plants or lower levels, in the food web control the numbers of the higher levels? And so that has kind of raged for a long time. I think for most of the history of ecology, people thought that the food supply was what really controlled everything. And reputedly, I read this recently, people thought, well, here are these big predators at the top, and they're just sort of sitting on top of the food web. And, they will just be basically eating whatever is available for them. And that's their impact. But actually, it turns out that there's really both of those kinds of interactions are happening. And we'll see that when we talk about how some food webs have been changed. So if the food supply alone is the key, then removing these top predators isn't going to have an impact. But in fact, both of those, top down, bottom up, are at work at the same time. And when you take anything out, sometimes the results are a little bit unpredictable. So I'll just give you a real simple example here. So here's a coyote, a cat, and a bird. Okay, I think of a lot of birds. You might think, hey, we don't want coyotes around because, hey, they sort of scare us a little bit or whatever. We don't want these things roving around. And when people remove coyotes, what happens is that stops their predation on cats. So there's more cats. And so negative means coyotes have a negative impact on cat populations. Cats have a negative impact on bird populations. Cats eat a lot of birds. And so if you then look at the overall impact of coyotes on songbirds, it's positive. So when you remove predators like coyotes, that increases songbird loss because there are other sort of what they call mesopredators, intermediate-sized predators like cats, that coyotes might eat. And so when you don't have any predation on these intermediate predators, then there's more loss of birds, and there's been a huge loss of birds. And as I was doing my reading, I came upon this picture. This is also in that book, Wilding. Cats are really fierce predators, and it turns out domesticated cats, I did not know this. I have confession right now. I used to have a cat, and I let our cat go outside. Because I thought, oh, I have a lot of mice around my place, and I thought, hey, it's good to eat the mice. Well, it turns out cats eat all kinds of stuff. And this is a picture that was in this book, Wilding. Domesticated cats kill billions of birds, small mammals, lizards, snakes, and amphibians every single year, okay? And in fact, domesticated cats are responsible for the extinction of at least 63 species, mostly birds. So any of you who have cats, it's really useful if you keep them indoors. And if I get another cat ever, I will keep that cat inside because I don't want to feel like this is on me. Aside. Okay. Now, other unexpected impacts of losing animals. So let's talk about, so here's 3 different examples. Here's the consumers, sea otters. Anybody who's been out in the California coast has seen, I hope, sea otters. I haven't been out there in a long time. But the case out there in 1971 looked like this, a lot of kelp. They're sort of fastened on the bottom, and then they have these long blades, super photosynthesizers, really awesome plants. But after the sea otter population crashed in the sort of early to mid 2000, the situation at this place looked more like this, okay, where there's not any kelp and there's just all this sort of junky stuff on the bottom. And that's because the sea otters eat sea urchins, okay, and the sea urchins consume the kelp. So when the sea otters are there, there's not many sea urchins, there's a lot of kelp. When the sea otters are not there, there's a lot of sea urchins and there's not much kelp, okay? So again, that's sort of a trickle-down impact. This is another example, which you might not, this has a few more steps, you might not have predicted. This is actually an experiment where the experimenters put a barrier here. And they took out all the bass, these largemouth bass over here. And what happened in this reservoir was the side with the bass stayed pretty clear. The side without the bass got all, clogged up with phytoplankton and algae, which turned basically green. And that's because the bass are eating the minnows, which eat the zooplankton. Those are animal plankton, very small things that are animals, and they often eat phytoplankton, which are, of course, plant-like small things, including these small algae. And so the side without the bass turned clogged up with all this algae and phytoplankton stuff. Not because the bass were eating it, but because they were eating the things that ate it. And then this is a more familiar example of predators. Jaguars and cougars eat mammalian herbivores. So when you have jaguars and cougars, this is in South America someplace, then you have understory, okay? Because there's not many herbivores. When you don't have jaguars and cougars, you have a lot of herbivores and they eat all of this, right? So you basically wind up not being able to regenerate the forest or anything. So these are, again, sort of trickle-down impacts of loss of animals that eat other things. Okay, so rewilding versus conservation. Traditional conservation occurs in nature preserves, isolated sites that have large value for nature, which have organisms, usually animals that have very low numbers, are threatened with extinction. And these nature preserves involve a lot of management, and it tends to be quite expensive. Okay, in the book Wilding, they call this these nature's Noah's Ark. These conventional conservation in nature preserves. So here's a graph of the project size in hectares. A hectare is like about 2.5 acres. From 2 million down to nothing. And here's management intensity. So conventional conservation usually tends to be very small with a lot of management intensity, which means they're very expensive. Okay, and I'll be telling you about 2 examples. I don't know whether the N is silent or not. Canep is a rewilding site in the UK. That's number 4 here. It's pretty small. Much lower management intensity. All of the rewilding sites are less management intense than the conservation. And here's some bigger ones going way up here. This is Yellowstone at 1.5 million hectares. So this is huge. In rewilding, which is these green symbols, the idea is to use a degraded or even an agricultural site that starts out with not very much natural value. Okay, it's not like you're trying to save a particular species. You're trying to rehabilitate the site, basically, or the food web that was at the site. And the idea is to add key species, whether they be predators or herbivores or what, to replace missing parts of the food web. So at these places that have had rewilding projects, there were big parts of the food web that was missing. And so things were out of whack because, there weren't predators, there weren't enough herbivores, whatever. And so the idea is you introduce these species and with some thought to replace missing parts of the food web. And then you step back. You don't hover over it all the time trying to do stuff. You basically step back, and the idea is to produce self-sustaining food webs that boost ecosystem services. The idea is not necessarily to go back and recreate the past, okay? Although many of the organisms that are introduced were, present in the past. Obviously, they're not present now. But the idea is not to necessarily go back and recreate the past. There's a little confusion about that in the literature. Okay, so if we, think we are trying to go back to some past, at least when there was some functioning food web there, which past? Probably not the megafauna of thousands of years ago, although there have been suggestions of, reintroducing things like that. We don't need to regenerate extinct animals, and I think actually that's a gigantic waste of money. We just need to replace their functions using similar organisms. So this is a picture also from, I forgot to put the page on, a picture also from the book Wilding, where here's a wild horse and an Exmoor pony, which is, I think there are some things which are much like the Exmoor ponies now. Auroch, which is that big, very old, big bovine, which they are extinct. Often they are replaced with Old English longhorns. Wild boars, excuse me, now I can't remember which one is the extinct one, but I think they're replaced with these pigs. So using proxies can work very well. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. We definitely don't want to try to recreate the situation at the time of, let's say in North America, at the time of American colonization, because a lot was already gone then. All those megafauna were already gone. And the idea that, and this happens with climate change too, is that, people don't live a very long time. And even, somebody old like me, we don't remember all that long either. So when we think, oh boy, let's create, if I were to say, let's recreate the situation so that it would be like when I was a kid in the early 1950s, well, we already lost an awful lot by then. Why would we want to recreate that? Because the ecosystem wasn't functioning very well then. And so that's called shifting baseline. So when people say, well, the climate doesn't, seem that bad, it's because A, they forget, and B, because there's this adaptation to the way things have become, so that we judge against our recent memory or maybe the way things were in the past, shifting baseline. The idea is with rewilding that we should aim to regenerate food webs that are high functioning, whether or not they're exactly the same as anything that ever was in the past. I think that's a much easier goal. Okay, so rewilding in Europe and UK and Europe has been focused mostly on large herbivores. And the idea, and again, a lot of this has been taken from the book Wilding by Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrow, to recreate these ancient grazing patterns. There are breeding programs to do what's called back breeding, to take ancient breeds of cattle and breed them together and then select using artificial selection like animals and plant breeders do, then to select individuals which are the most like, say, an auroch, okay? And they do this for a bunch of generations and they wind up, this is not a picture of an extinct auroch. This is a picture of a backbred individual, which is a lot like an auroch. And there's a lot of ancient breeds. These are the English longhorns, and there are ancient Welsh cattle, etc. The other large organisms include buffalo, which are being reintroduced in Europe, and water buffalo, which already live there. And then there's conic wild horses, which are very I think that they went extinct and now they're doing back breeding to sort of create something that looks like a conic horse. There's this great picture in the book Wilding, which shows that the English longhorn is very reminiscent of what ancient cave dwellers drew on the walls of caves. Okay, giant bovines, also horses that look like these Exmoor ponies, etc. So the idea is to take some of these proxies now and reintroduce them in different ways. So I'll just give you one example at this Connect Farm in UK. And apologies to Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell if I mispronounced that. But this farm was or has been the Burrell family estate for like 200 years. This family have lived there, 3,500 acres. It was intensive agriculture and dairy, and it started to just lose a lot of money. And the soil health went down. Everything was really not doing all that well. And it was mostly mature pasture and a little bit of mature pasture and mostly tilled cropland. Here's after they introduced the old English longhorns, and there's the crumbling old castle. And they also introduced this white stork, which had been lost from Europe, and they pointed out that this stork has built a gigantic nest on top of one of the turrets. I wanted to point that out to you because I think that's so cool. Anyway, so here are these cattle grazing around this old castle. And what they did was the areas that were pasture, they reseeded with native grasses and introduced some of these old English cattle. Some of the cropland was left fallow or reseeded with wildflower and grasses. As there are different blocks that they did slightly different things. They introduced fallow deer, red deer, longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, and some kind of pigs. And the situation there is that there aren't any big predators that are, keeping the cattle numbers down or anything. Some of these big, gigantic old things like the oryx were so big, they really didn't hardly have any predators. But they need to keep the numbers to some reasonable level. So they sell the pigs and the cattle. They harvest a lot of cattle. I think they said something like 75 tons per year or something. They sell that for meat, and they allow hunting of deer to keep the numbers down. So there's a whole big section of this 400-page book, which is very practical, like how do you know how many animals to introduce, and what do you do, if you start to have too many. So I didn't really cover that very much, but if you're interested in rewilding, I really recommend that book. They expect all of the fields to become what they call wood pasture. Which is they describe it as a shifting mosaic of pasture and glades of trees. There are some old oaks that were there, in the fields and remain there, but the cattle sort of rip up a lot of the shrubs, and then they'll move on, and the things will grow back. So they report that they've been at this for 20 years now. Things have really changed a lot on the property, and they report that many of the key ecosystem services have been restored. They have better soil health, they have better water quality, they have much less flooding, and they have had the luxury of doing this because, well, I guess if you have a family who has a 3,500-acre estate, they probably weren't all that hard up for money, but they didn't want to throw any more of it away by just leaving it in agriculture. So anyway, really interesting situation. I can't even begin to tell you all the details, and I urge you to read it for yourself. In the book, they describe a sort of idealized rewilding process in the lower parts of the UK, where it basically is agriculture like this. And through various transformations, they suggest that if we were able to do a lot of rewilding, it could turn out to be something like this. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the differences and the changes. So here's this landscape. There's a big like expressway here. There's a little roadway here with very narrow hedges on the hedgerows on the sides. There's a like a pine plantation here. There's a canal. This was a river, but has been channelized like so many rivers. And so basically the idea was that channelizing the rivers would prevent flooding, but actually that it works just the opposite. It's sort of a counterintuitive thing. And as they describe it, what we have here in this agricultural setting, and I also talked to you about this in the soil talk, is that in agriculture, the soil gets very compacted. And when you have heavy rains, then this floods very, very quickly. and because this little channelized stream can't manage it. Then there's an isolated bit of woods here, and any animals that are in there really have nowhere to go because there's nothing around there they can migrate to and no way to get anywhere else. And most of this is just monoculture. So I'll just describe a few of the changes. They describe a rewilded area where they've introduced some different larger herbivores. They've made an overpass over the road, very important because if you don't have overpasses, animals step out in the road. We all know that with deer and whatnot. And this overpass also connects to another rewilded area over here. So that's like a nice little connection. There's an area where they have introduced large herbivores. And so now we have this patchwork of trees and grassland. Here's an area where they're, I guess, running some cows in a sort of rotational grazing thing. The hedgerows have been made wider. They go into a big deal in the Wilding book about how if you just increase the width of hedgerows between fields like these, okay, then and this is actually a theme in regenerative agriculture, which I would have talked about if I had been able to give that talk, but I'll tell you about later. If you have a wider hedgerow, then you get a lot more habitat for insects and natural enemies that help you control pests in agricultural fields, but there's also more sites for birds. And so this really, widening these hedgerows really helps with wildlife a lot. And what they've done is they've done, more rewilding down here, and then there's corridors where these rewilded areas can sort of exchange migrants. These have to be fenced if they're, in a habitat where there's actually people, because people, I'll get on this later, but people are basically afraid of most animals. And so they, they don't want the animals running around on the road and stuff. And this is now a naturally regenerated woodland of native trees instead of this uniform stand like a pine plantation, which basically gets cut down every, 10 or 20 years and used for timber and then replanted with seeds from some, tree that doesn't even live there. In this book, Wilding, they stress how important it is to be very careful if you plant trees that you get them from a place that has grown them from native seed. And this is one of the things that is a big problem in tree planting efforts, because it's very hard often to find native trees for areas which have actually grown nearby that area. And then so there's another rewilded area over here. And here's a dead tree left standing, which has some birds in it. They've introduced some large herbivores over here, but I wanted to show you the difference between this and this channelized, basically now canal. It used to be a river, now a canal. And what they've done here, what the Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell did on their farm was to actually manually block up areas of stream, like what a beaver would do. And that slows things down and causes the water to spread out. So you get this much more diffuse, slow moving water. And then beavers can come in and start, doing their thing. And this is a much more productive area than this, right? And so I'll talk a little bit later about the kinds of incentives that might make it possible for farmers who have an area like this to want to rewild some of their farm. Okay. There's a lot more information in the book that I can't cover. Now let's move to the US. Rewilding in the US has focused on predators, and the big example that everybody talks about is the removal and replacement of wolves in Yellowstone and other Western states. And so here's a very simplified food web for wolves here's wolves and coyotes. Up here at the top is predators. Hawks are predators. Then we've got deer, elk, and beaver. There's a lot more things that a lot more organisms these guys eat, but these are the ones that have figured very prominently in these studies. And then we have the primary food, cottonwood, willow, and there's aspen also, which isn't shown on here, and then grasses. So I just want to do a little thought experiment first. What happens if you take out wolves? Now, it might seem like a great idea to eliminate wolves. And since I've been thinking about this, I've noticed all these articles coming onto my email about ranchers killing wolves, here, there, and somewhere else, and what various states are doing to try to protect the wolves, or how many wolves they're allowing to be killed. Really interesting. Anyway, so what happens if you take out the wolves? It turns out that when you take out the wolves, a lot of stuff happens. Chiefly, the elk and the deer, which are the primary prey of the wolves, at least according to this, the biggest prey, elk and the deer go up because they don't have their predator there anymore, right? So elk and deer go up. Elk and deer go up, they start eating the heck out of the cottonwood and the willows and the aspens, which drives them down, right? So here you are, you've taken out the wolves. Maybe you're a rancher, or maybe you just are afraid of wolves or something. Maybe you just want to go out and hunt something that's fierce and is going to snarl at you. I don't know. Anyway, take out the wolves. All of a sudden, you got none of these plants or little trees left. Even the grass is going down. You take out the wolves, the coyotes increase because they're not being eaten by the wolves, which means that the beavers go down, the mice go down, the hawks go down because there's not as much small stuff for the hawks to eat. You lose a lot at the lower levels of the food web, when people probably thought, hey, well, who needs those wolves anyway? So cottonwood, willow, shrubs, and grass and berry bushes all got grazed down by the increased number of elk and deer. Food and wood for the beavers were reduced, and the streams, because the beavers weren't slowing the streams down anymore, the streams eroded, which impacted fish. Fewer nest sites and less habitat for insects, which reduces birds because these trees were being eaten. And the coyotes increased and ate more small mammals and mid-sized predators. So the big birds, eagles, hawks, peregrine falcons, ospreys, all declined. So you take out one thing there at the top, and it basically messes up the whole system. So the last wolf was removed from Yellowstone in 1926. In 1995 and 96, wolves were added back into Yellowstone. So wolves were added back, deer and elk declined, willow, cottonwood, aspen increased, and it also helped the beaver and small mammals and all the other things that were, sort of reduced by removing the wolves. But everything I've read said, even though they did this in 1995 and 96, it's going to take decades for the system to really recover. And in the meantime, there's this anxiety with people who want to get rid of the wolves again. All right. So here's some pictures and some graphics for people who like graphs. Here's what happened. Here's 1995. I put these dotted lines in here to just give you a sort of anchor for each of these little panels. The wolves were reintroduced in 1995, 20 of them, and then 20 more the next year, and they increased and they've declined again because of hunting. Elk decreased as the wolves increased because the wolves were eating them. The browsing, that's like eating of shrubs and small woody plants, decreased because there's not as many elk. Willow increased. Cottonwood took a while, but it increased. Beavers came back. Okay, so this is like all good, right? More like the balanced food web that that was there before. And so here's some pictures. 1997, just 2 years after the wolves were reintroduced. 2001 and 2010, you can see that the vegetation is recovering. So there's, more bunch grasses and some shrubs, and then a lot more shrubs and everything as it recovers. And here's one of the investigators in 2006 showing that basically there's just these tiny little aspen saplings. And then by 2010, the aspens are, growing back. These are the old established aspens that were, there before the wolves were removed. And this dark stuff is where the elk and deer have scraped the bark off. Okay, these were able to survive that somehow, but is long-term age due to bark stripping. So this is recovery of the aspens, which is also very nice. Okay, so those are the two examples I want to give you. There's so many more cool examples, but I didn't have time to talk about it. So you might want to ask, well, do we have enough land to do rewilding? Okay, here in the this is a global. Okay, we definitely have enough land to do rewilding. Right now, 77% of our agricultural land is used to feed animals. And so the deal with that is you grow plants and you feed them to animals. And what happens is the animals use up a lot of the energy walking around and just maintaining themselves. So a lot of the calories that were in the plant food never reach humans, right? Because the animals burn them off. So it's sort of inefficient, right? 77% of the agricultural land is used for livestock to grow feed and also graze. Sorry, this is also grazing. Yet that only supplies 18% of the global calories and not even 40% of the global protein. So if we reduced meat consumption by 50%, that doesn't mean you can never have a hamburger again. Reduce it by 50%. That would liberate 20 million square kilometers. It's a lot of land, more than enough to do a lot of interesting rewilding and build back a lot of biodiversity. Now, it's important for the people who have the land to feel like they're not just, sacrificing their livelihood to do something good for the world. They're not going to do that, right? And so I think it's important to have some kind of government subsidies for the common good. Okay. Now our government subsidizes a lot of things that are not for the common good. Okay. They subsidize the raising of cattle, for example. Well, okay, whatever. I won't talk about that anymore, but they could spend some money supporting rewilding projects to improve nature, because it would also help restore ecosystem services like reducing flooding. And they could justify these expenditures by pointing out and remembering that when you improve ecosystem services like helping to clean the water by reducing flooding, that counters a lot of the impacts that we're experiencing from climate change. Floods are increasing like mad. And we're losing water, we're losing clean water. And so if we had these areas where flooding was reduced because of rewilding or other things that we're doing, that would be a bonus, right? That would save a lot of money. I think it's just beginning to dawn on people how much it is costing us to leave climate change unchecked, right? To have, I don't know how many of you are in Maryland, but it's broiling out there today. And the Midwest is having another heat wave. Heat-related deaths are increasing. Floods are increasing. All kinds of bad stuff is increasing. Hurricanes, disasters, this all costs money. If we restored our ecosystems a little bit, that would save a ton of money, okay? If we could just also curb the use of fossil fuels. I know, broken record. A lot of people who were able to rewild their area could benefit from enhanced tourism. For example, one thing they suggest in the book is, here you have this nice corridor between rewilded areas. You could have hiking trails and cycling trails and everything on there. People could have bed and breakfast. They could benefit from a more tourism economy in these areas, because people like to be out in nature. People realize that this is great for their mental health. And whereas, hanging around in, pavement is not good for your mental health. The other thing is that these rewilded areas can produce agricultural products like cattle raised on these, sort of roaming around in these areas in these woodland pastures or in rotational grazing. There could be other grazing livestock or crops produced using sort of no-till and cover crops, et cetera, the regenerative techniques. Wood from forests grown regeneratively. There's some strategy they use in Europe where they just go in and take a few trees and then allow those gaps to fill in naturally. So there could be, income from that. I don't think it's insurmountable. Okay, but you got to first have the vision of this is a good thing to do. Then you can sort of say, how can we pay for it? If it's a good thing to have those predators back, then we have to figure out, how do we calm people's minds about that? Okay, barriers to more large-scale rewilding in the U.S. I think it is no surprise that people in general are afraid of animals. People are used to dogs and cats, but they're especially afraid of carnivores. And so here's a coyote. If you have coyotes in your area, for goodness sakes, don't feed them. Okay, there was some huge problems caused in Dallas when a coyote came into the neighborhood and people were leaving food out for it. They would, leave their food delivered on their front step and the coyote would come up and eat it. I mean, you got to be really careful. Wild animals are wild. I know all of you have seen these news stories about people who, I don't get this. People are out in, some national park and there's buffalo out there and they go right up to the buffalo to take a selfie. And, hello, wild animals are not meant to be by people. So if you go to a park where there's wild animals, don't go over to them. If a coyote, even fox, is in your neighborhood, let it do its thing. Don't leave out food for it. So I saw this article, August 19th, okay, as I was preparing for this webinar. Uptick in coyote sightings alarms New Yorkers as wildlife return to the Bronx. I thought, oh man, you just got to let the coyotes do their thing, right? There's plenty of rats and other stuff in the Bronx for the coyotes to eat. Just make sure you don't wind up feeding them because you don't want them coming around your house expecting something. So just try to live with them. There are a lot of conflicts with cattle ranchers, and I have read at least 8 articles in the news recently about cattle ranchers killing wolves and people being upset that I think I read something, one state up there, the amount of wolves that could be killed to like over 300. And so environmentalists are worried about that. The ranchers are like, well, we can't let them just eat our cattle. But it turns out that coyotes kill more cattle. 3% of all cattle are killed by coyotes, and less than 0.5% killed by wolves, right? But wolves are bigger and people worry about them more. And many states, I did a little homework on this, many states publish guidelines for how you can protect cattle if you live in an area where there are wolves. And there are sort of common sense things you can do. But you already know that if somebody sees a wolf and if a wolf actually manages to kill a calf, I don't think a wolf would kill a full-grown cow, but a calf, they're going to be really bent out of shape about it. Now, it turns out in Colorado that Colorado will reimburse farmers if they can actually prove that a wolf killed their cattle. But, the ranchers aren't happy with that because they say it's too hard to prove, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not a rancher. I'm not making my livelihood like that. But again, we got to figure it out so that we don't have to get rid of all animals because we're afraid of them. I was sort of interested in this. This guy, Josh Donlan, was a grad student at Cornell. I was at Cornell from 1987 to 97, so I was there before he was there. But it sort of caught my eye because of that. And he published a paper with some other people in Nature in 2005, proposing to reintroduce some megafauna to the U.S. And he was really thinking about, sort of going back, trying to recreate some of the Pleistocene, that's 12,000 years ago, Pleistocene habitat. He was really reamed out later on by a lot of people like, we don't want, XYZ predator roaming around. And I felt terrible for him when I read how savagely people were treating his ideas. I don't particularly think we need to do any generation of mammoths or other megafauna, but they're like, don't tell me you want to introduce camels, don't tell me you want to introduce lions. It's like, anyway, I was sort of offended by that, honestly. And I read somewhere, and then I couldn't find it again after I realized I wanted to put it in here. But Europe is way ahead of the US on rewilding, even though the population density is much greater there. There are a lot of areas in Europe where, there are natural areas, and they are interested in doing rewilding. And so there's a lot of rewilding projects in Europe that we're not even beginning to see in the US. I think I have my own opinions on this, so this is my opinion. But I think sometimes Americans are like, well, we're so independent. You can't make me wear a mask, even though that would be, for the public good during COVID. Don't make me wear a mask. I think there's not a good understanding of how sort of we all have to interact together, my opinion. But at least Europe is doing a good job on rewilding. Oh, this is a picture from Josh Donlan's article showing here are some of the things he wanted to introduce, including a giant tortoise and, lions and some other stuff. Big elephants. I think this might be a cougar. Potential economic and cultural conflict and potential economic and cultural value. So these would be of high value, but also high conflict. And so when you have high conflict, it's never going to get done because people are going to be about it all the time. Okay, so there are definitely barriers, but I think that there would be a lot of people in the US interested in doing this if there were, subsidies for it. Okay, so they didn't have to give up their income. Rewilding cities. I'm running a little bit late, but I just want to touch on this. A lot of cities around the world are doing rewilding exercises. So you might not think of planting native plants along the abandoned High Line railroad in New York as being rewilding, but pollinators are, wild. So that is rewilding. Here are some rooftops in London with native plants. Singapore has really gone hog wild on having a lot of native plants and animals around. These are big solar towers. It's really wacky. You can read about that in the book Wilding. This is a picture of not rooftop, of vertical gardens on high-rise apartment buildings in Milan, and here's one in China, where people are getting a lot of benefit, and probably pollinators are too, from planting plants on their balconies. A couple more slides here, rewilding our communities, planting native plants for pollinators. I just learned about this yesterday, that in 2023, Maryland, yay Maryland, passed a law that allows power companies to plant, encourages them to plant native plants along transmission corridors. And there was a study of such a corridor up in Connecticut and New Hampshire, which here's a picture of it, actually. So here's the transmission lines. And they found that these corridors actually harbored 325 different, this is 85 miles, different native plant species and 205 different bee species, which is very cool. Here are some of these cool little bees, which are really awesome. And so this is a really great use of the sort of wasted land where you can, these are, I think, goldenrod or something. So this is a great thing to do. And hopefully BG and Pepco and some of the other utilities that operate in Maryland, those are the two main ones, will start to do more of this. Rewilding yards to, I have to show this again. This is my yard. I just have to show you. I thought this was so awesome. These are swallowtail butterflies on Joe Pyeweed. This is like 6 foot tall Joe Pyeweed. And as long as this was in bloom, and there's some black swallowtails zooming in there too. As long as this was in bloom, this is what it looked like all day long, these swallowtails on there. And my property is surrounded by tulip poplars, which is the host plant for swallowtail caterpillars. And so there's a black one. And so lots of swallowtails, which just makes me, so happy. This is like a little bee on a coneflower. These are all pictures I took in my yard. And here's this is not a bee, it's a fly that's a bee mimic, which I think is kind of cool. There's 96 million backyards in the US, and they average a quarter acre. So that's 24 million acres that could be used to boost pollinators. We could make a huge difference. So all of you Doug Tallamy devotees know this. Let me see. Oops, let's go the other way. So I just want to finish by talking a little bit about rewilding your garden. These are pictures again from the book Wilding, and so that's a book about the UK, and these are little characters of UK gardens, little tiny spaces, okay, with fences. So there's a whole big block of these flats. And they got mowed grass, and they've got a little area around the edge for a few shrubs and a lot of bark mulch and stuff. Is typical. It's not so different from the typical U.S. garden. Little patio, and here's the spray. They're spraying stuff, and they're using their leaf blower. So this is stage one. Stage two, they've let the grass grow. Maybe they've planted some native grasses and mowed some pathways. So all of a sudden they have these happy kids they didn't have before. They've grown a hedge around the edge, which is supporting a lot of insects. They've grown some other plants, probably some native plants. They've got a little pile of logs back here, which is serving as good habitat. They made a little pond, which is kind of cool. And they still have a little bit of lawn, but not like this. And then the final stage, oh, here's a cover of that book. I can't recommend this book highly enough. It was really inspiring and interesting. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I want to dive in even more. But this is sort of the end stage in the imagination of these two folks, where there's more trees and shrubs and more plants. They've moved their table out here. They got rid of that little patio. There's the little stepping stones. I don't know how. I don't know where this is going, right? But they've still got their pond and stuff. And so this now is going to have a lot of insects that would never be present, if I can go back here, in this. And I wanted to point out one thing that I thought I noticed this spring. I had a lot of lightning bugs in my yard. Okay, lightning bugs, little beetles. Okay, everybody knows that maybe, but they're beetles, and they're herbivores. And I had a lot. And I was wondering whether all the native plants in my yard might have been helping them out a little bit. I find them on my garden plants sometimes too, but so I walked around the neighborhood and I did not notice. It's like so unquantified, right? Okay, hardly scientific. But I think that all the native plants in my yard fostered these things. I love lightning bugs. I tried to take a video of them, but of course I couldn't get a good one. Anyway, if you plant native plants in your yard, you're going to get a lot of good stuff coming in. So I have to finish. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late. Paul Hawkins says in his book, Regeneration, we live in a sacred miracle. And again, as an evolutionary biologist, thinking about how things interact, I totally feel that way. We should act like it. This is a gift we have, our natural world, and we should help protect it. Here's some more of those oryx. Here's another area in my yard. I didn't mention anything in particular about these Highland cattle, but they're very cool. I think that is the last slide. Yes. So, Anne, can you turn on your video and maybe